Welcome to the Unitarian Christian Alliance podcast.
Hey, not yet.
Sorry.
Episode 31, Behind the Scenes, with guest and host Brandon Duke, and I'm the host and guest, Mark Cain. Okay, that's not at all clear. Let me ponder that. In the meantime, the Unitarian Christian Alliance is an organization that does two things: provides resources on the one God and his human Messiah, and provides a self-serve directory where anyone who agrees with the affirmation about the one God can sign up and put a spot on the map on their postal code. Now, why do that? Because fellowship and connection is an essential element of life, and especially of faith. You see, because of our commitment to what we find in Scripture, many of us are isolated, and not necessarily of our own choosing. The UCA is a tool to help us find each other. It is not a church or a denomination or a league for water polo. As more people sign up, more spots show up on the map. If you haven't seen the map yet, you've got to go look. UnitarianChristianAlliance.org. Click on the map. It's amazing. And this represents only a tiny fraction of us. There are many, many more who see the Trinity for what it is, an imposition onto the Jewish framework of the New Testament. As they say, implied by the whole of Scripture, yet, curiously, never actually taught. Today is a reversal. I will be answering questions. Brandon Duke will be the interviewer. He reached out to me several weeks ago with the idea.
Truth be told, I'm still very leery and suspicious. I know Brandon, and, well, he can be rather lighthearted sometimes, not taking things nearly as seriously as I would. He laughs too much, and it's just not the kind of thing I would normally tolerate on this illustrious podcast. I fight and claw to gain the respect of the theological academic community. I am not about to throw it all away with one flippant comment by Brandon Duke.
Okay, yeah, I actually will. You may have heard Sean Finnegan interview me way back on his Restitutio podcast, number 368. It was December of 2020. The UCA podcast was still young, and the interview was more about me. Go check that out if you haven't yet. Today is more about how I do the podcast, what I'm thinking about, or devilishly scheming, depending on your perspective. I've learned more. I've had time to grow and contemplate. So here we are, 30 episodes done already. It seemed a good time to pause and reflect.
So now I get to steal Mark's chair and put him over in the hot seat.
Ouch.
Which I've been looking forward to. I get to ask you a few questions about the podcast. So thanks for letting me indulge my curiosity here, Mark.
Well, I've done this enough to people already. I've been I've been the instigator of this kind of stuff to others. It's only fair
to turn these tables around.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of other Unitarian content out there, podcasts and teaching materials and things like that. What got you interested in doing this podcast, and what do you find unique about the objectives and the missions of this podcast?
Well, when I was interviewed by Sean Finnegan, I think I briefly touched upon my radio past. I wanted to have a Christian talk show, and I was excited about that. But radio was on the decline. Once podcasts started becoming a thing, I eventually knew that I would probably do a podcast. I just had never gotten around to it. And about 2 years ago, I thought I would do my own. I had some plans for what my podcast would be. But again, I was so busy. Well, and then COVID happened, and the UCA conference got canceled. And I'm on the board of the UCA, and we had this discussion. Like, well, what are we going to do? Because part of what the conference was going to be was connecting people in person. This was like the big chance to meet these people that you might have never met. And the idea of the podcast came up during that discussion. And they just kind of looked at me because they'd known that was kind of something I'd been interested in. Like, Mark, would you do the UCA podcast? At first, I didn't want to do it because I felt it would be too narrow. Like, wait a minute, but if I do the UCA podcast, I can't just talk about anything that I'm interested in because some things are just interesting to me. So Like, the UCA podcast is intended to be of interest to Unitarian Christians around the world. Well, how do I do that without taking out all sorts of details and things that were just completely Mark favorite topics, you know? So I was resistant to the idea for a while, but as it turns out, one of the magical things about limitations is that it engages the mind. When you're told, hey, you know, this is a box of Legos and I want you to build something, and you look in there and there's only 35 Legos, well, how can I build something out of just 35 Legos? Well, then you start thinking differently than you had ever thought before. You could have had a tray of millions of Lego pieces and the sky's the limit. But no, they hand you 35 and you're like, what? So when I thought, well, what would I do if I was only talking to Unitarian Christians, but yet still be of interest to them no matter where they are on the planet? And then these interesting ideas started coming to mind, and it engaged me and made me want to do it. So I felt, okay, let's connect people together. Let's have topics that are broadly interesting and can really encourage these people who, many of them, are alone.
Yeah, lots of the listeners are isolated, including this one. And so, yeah, there's something kind of magical about being able to connect to people through their voice, through the way that you interview them. You do kind of, it seems there's the interview episodes and then there's the monologue episodes, like the first one, which I really like. Like, how do the monologues appear all of a sudden? Do you just get inspiration or do you schedule them in?
Well, the first monologue, I had so many thoughts building up to the launch of the UCA podcast that I had to condense them together to lay the groundwork for it all. I wanted it to be, that's why this podcast exists. That was my hope for episode 1. So I put a lot of time into that. And of course, it was just a monologue. Interviews you don't have as much control over. They go unique ways and they end up with surprises and fun. That is how we establish community. We bring in voices, unique stories that you don't normally hear because, you know, some of my guests, to be honest, they're just people.
Oh, yeah.
They're just normal people. They don't...
Aren't we all?
Yeah. You know, I don't get a lot of book authors and scholars and doctors of religious studies, you know.
Yeah. And then they have these amazing stories and they're inspirational and they're moving. And I have more than once got teary-eyed driving down the road and listening to an interview.
Yes. Hildy Chandler's interview was one of those.
Oh, yeah.
When I finally decided, okay, yeah, I'll do this, I had heard that Hildy had a time with Keegan at the dinner table, and that was one of those things in my mind that I wish I could have been there. And it dawned on me, wait, if I'm doing this podcast, I'll just ask Hildy to tell me what happened, and then we can all be there. Yeah. And so I reached out to Hildy, and bless her heart, she had not heard this podcast. It was completely new. She took a bit of a leap of faith in putting herself out there, letting me ask her these questions. It was 3 interviews, and all 3 of them, we probably talked for over an hour each one, and then I had to edit it down. So she committed a lot of time to that. But to get back to your point about the monologue versus the interviews, 3 whole episodes with Hildy had my mind just filled with thoughts. I would listen to them in the car, trying to see how I did the audio editing, and it would just take me in different directions. And I knew I had to unleash that pressure. So it was time for a monologue. So the episode after Hildy is me reflecting on so much of what had happened there. So that's probably the most common reason that I would do a monologue, is that just something is really getting thicker and heavier on my heart, and I just want to lay it all out and get it over with.
Mark's pressure release valve.
Yeah. Another reason that I like to do it is because I feel variety is part of what makes for a great podcast.
Yeah.
If it was just interviews of people, and especially interviews of how did you discover God was one, it's a part of their story, and I don't mind including that because I think that tells a really neat experience, and people come from different aspects.
Yeah.
But there's also the person themselves and their actual story.
Sure.
So I get the variety that I want so that I stay interested in the episodes by occasionally stopping and just doing a monologue and editing it, having a little more time thinking about sound effects and other fun things I can do because, hey, you know, it's just me.
Yeah.
Whereas editing interviews is actually quite a bit of work because it's not controlled. It's like this conversation. We could interrupt each other and talk over the top of each other, and it makes for a very unique and sometimes effort-filled work.
To try to clean that up. Well, I appreciate all the effort and the way that it comes out. I know you've said before that you don't want it to just be too theology heavy. But I'm sometimes surprised at how much theology content comes out naturally in these interviews. I was listening to episode 25 with Anne, and her description, her growing up in a world where agency is just fundamental to the culture.
Yes.
That her brother would go and he was her father
Mm-hmm.
when he went on her father's behalf. And that just made Jesus' agency for God, it was just totally natural for her.
Yeah.
That is the most persuasive description of what's called shaliach, or shaliach, my Hebrew is terrible, of that principle
Yeah.
that I think I've ever heard, because it was just natural. It was just her life. She's like, this is how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas us in the West, we're like, well, my attorney's got some responsibility for me, but if he says something really stupid, though, that's not me in front of the judge, right?
Yeah.
Or, my doctor can make some of these decisions, with my approval. And it's just a totally different way of living and doing business and transacting. I can just imagine how natural that would have been to the authors of the New Testament to think of Jesus in that way,
Mm-hmm.
thanks to her. And that was an interview where it was just her telling her story, which was fascinating.
Yes.
And yet right in here is this golden nugget of insight into this really significant theological idea that often gets kind of dismissed. That's overemphasized by Unitarian types that want to focus on this agency aspect for Jesus rather than his divine nature. And then there she was persuading me of something that I already thought was true, but I'm like, okay, that's just really helpful. So,
Yeah. She even has Jewish words in her vocabulary.
yeah.
When you look at the map and you say, oh, wait, yeah, that's just right down through Nile.
Yep.
Culture doesn't change rapidly except in the last 100 years. I think before that, culture was very slow in its movement.
Sure.
We've screwed it up with the internet and, American movies and all this.
With the information age.
Yeah.
Right.
But here it is. It's like, no, that's this. She completely recognized what was 2,000 years old, still present in her culture and her life today.
So in several instances, as I've listened to podcasts, you have this intentional nod towards Trinitarians that might sort of be lurking and listening. It sounds like you sometimes get feedback.
Mm-hmm.
What's your approach towards that part of the audience? Are you looking for this to be an evangelistic tool, or
That's probably been one of the hardest things to really pin down in my mind. I had thoughts early on that they might listen a lot, and then I realized I can't think about that too much because I really want to accomplish the purpose of connecting the Unitarian Christians who feel isolated, making them feel welcome, making them know that there are others. Like way, way higher importance to me than a Trinitarian hearing it and saying, oh, I've never thought of that before. But I've been arguing theology my whole life. It started in high school with my friends. We'd stay up late at night talking theology. It's so I've always wanted to persuade, but I've also always enjoyed the process of talking about theology. And as the podcast unfolded, especially with Hildy Chandler's episode, I realized, oh, this totally works. You let people tell their story in the natural cadence of their story, how it unfolded for them, and then these points will just appear naturally. And I don't have to force it. I don't have to stop them and say, yeah, but what about that verse? Or what about this verse? You let the story happen, and it becomes a very very
organic?
Yeah.
Natural?
Yes, a very organic experience that is not filled with pressure or intensity. You could be a Trinitarian listening to this and be like, well, I completely disagree with where they went on that or why she might have thought that. But you don't feel threatened by it.
Yeah.
You're just listening to her tell her story, and it just lets you think about it.
Yeah.
What I want here is something where it's enjoyable enough to listen to that a Trinitarian would be happy to do it. I am a little bit harsh with my humor, a little bit snarky. I don't know. That's just me, I guess.
Well, and it's countered. I mean, you're explicit in there saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is my sense of humor. And I do think as a listener, I think it comes across that there's no animosity there.
Okay.
That you're just having a good time, like you said, arguing theology from time to time, intermingled into these discussions with people that lets us see them as real humans. I mean, hopefully as time goes on, this is going to reach more and more Unitarians and bring them together and cause them to to connect either by going to the conference or connecting via Facebook or fellowships or, literally finding churches that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But also, like you said, if there's just space in the podcast, there's like air where people can listen and tune in and share it. There's a reason testimony is a key part of most evangelism. It just works. It's how we understand each other, and it's how we get persuaded.
I've had this question posed to me like, okay, Mark, well, what is this podcast about? And my answer is, well, if you want to listen just to get an idea, I don't want to try to demand that you listen to the whole podcast, but please listen to episode 1 and you'll know why I'm doing the podcast. And then episodes 2, 3, and 4 with Hildy Chandler. And there you'll see it lived out. The why will become infleshed or inaudioed in Hildy's story. Hildy manifests what it was that I was trying to explain in episode 1. It's not as simple as you think. It's hard. There are challenges. You pay a price. Just listen to those 4 episodes, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you don't have to agree. I don't even expect that they would agree. It's not like, man, Hildy's testimony is so good, they'll be Unitarians by the time this is over. Not at all.
Right.
I would rather they just say, oh, I see why this would be a problem. And I see why this would be so hard on somebody who was raised one way, but now is torn with, well, what do I do when what I see in Scripture and what I'm told from my own pulpit doesn't agree?
Well, that's definitely one of my favorite moments from the podcast is her description of sitting at the table and realizing my son is a heretic. And,
yes.
So speaking of favorite moments, are there any moments from the podcast that are particular favorites for you?
Well,
no, there's a lot to pick from.
There's the one that was the most funnest, let me get the grammar correct. The most funnest one to do was credibility and God's death. 2 parts of that were really interesting. One, because it was a challenge from a Trinitarian listener. How do I answer that question? It wasn't a theological challenge. It had to do more with credibility, which is why I called it that. But the other part of it was around Easter, and I had this picture in my mind of what if the disciples found out that, in fact, Yahweh was on the cross, and they just stuck a spear in his side and well, well, that was nice while it lasted.
The ultimate replacement theology right there. Our God's literally been killed.
So, this would be just a bizarrely interesting skit, and I had to do it. So I put all that together. It's kind of a monologue episode, but there is an actual story, skit, voices. It was so fun, Brandon. It was so fun that it is going to become something further in a little while.
Oh, okay. It's got to give us something more than that.
Yeah, you'll see it in YouTube.
Okay, all right. Follow UCA YouTube channel. You can see what Mark's talking about.
Right. I think the other moment that I really felt deeply and it just so meaningful to me, it was in Hildy's second interview. That would be episode 3, where the scales fall off her eyes and she's looking at the passage and she's like, I've been wrong. And what was so interesting about that, I hadn't done a lot of audio editing up to that point. And in the interview, she didn't want to get too emotional. And so she was trying to compensate for being literally choked up. She got loud. She was like, la, la, la. She energized up to try to push past the emotional moment. And then after about 5 seconds, came right back to where she really was.
Because she was reliving it. Yeah.
Yes. So when I'm going back to editing it afterwards, I hear these bursts of energy of her just trying to emotionally cope with that moment. I have to cut all these things out. Because what really is happening is that quiet, soft voice of I was wrong. So that editing effort, I probably spent well over an hour on what was about 15 seconds to 20 seconds of audio. Because I would remove one little part and then listen and be like, well, no, now it sounds like I removed something that she said. Then I'd put it back in and take out this. Finally, I got the spacing about right and just took out those louder, energetic parts and shuffled a couple little phrases that she said so that it flowed naturally. And when she heard it back, she says, I relived that moment as I heard that. She recognized that as what happened, even though here I had been tweaking the audio for so long. so that the listener would hear what I know she was saying.
Yeah. So in a sense, you gave us the purest version of what she was actually trying to communicate.
Yeah.
That is the magic of podcasts. So it seems like you really focus on creating a tone for the podcast that's welcoming and that is that's non-threatening and non-aggressive. Are those words that you would use to describe it?
Yes, those are correct terms. I'm a firm believer that the whole process of life is about different ideas that buffet back and forth, and that process of disagreeing, thinking more, challenging yourself, and then moving the next step and doing that again, that whole process is just what's supposed to happen. It should be fun. It should be just part of growing in life. And, from my childhood, when I started having debates with my friends, I discovered that talking about theology was fun and lighthearted for me because I always had this thought in my mind, like, well, God's going to make it clear eventually, and I might be entirely wrong, and I'm okay with that. Let's just go down this road and do our parts. What is our parts? Well, it's me expressing what I think. It's you expressing what you think, and we chew on it. That's how we do it, and it should be fun. And, well, I've seen Dyer and, this is very serious here, and, if you believe this way, you're basically worshiping Satan, and I'm sorry to tell you that. Like, oh, well, that kind of turned the fun knob down a bit. So
yeah, I mean, my perception is you are actively trying to engage in a way that is not cringy. It's not stressful. There are a lot of podcasts out there that they're that way, and some people really love that, right?
True.
Where it's this high energy kind of talk show, yelling at each other kind of a thing. But this is a much more, I don't know, contemplative, kind of quiet, sitting, with coffee together and sharing. It seems much more intimate than that.
Yeah.
And more meaningful, maybe.
Yeah. Something that I do, I'm going to peel back the curtain and let you know my secrets. But I learned this when I was taking radio training. At the time I was learning radio, which was 26 years ago, 29. Wait.
They had electricity back then?
Yeah. It was around 93 and 1994.
Millennials, this is before smartphones.
Yes.
Just for the record.
Yeah, so like 27 years ago, when I was actually learning some of the details about the trade of the radio, they had already figured out that the better radio hosts were the ones who knew that your audience was just that person sitting in the car driving to work, not a room full of people. Because way back, it was, hey, everyone out there in radio land,
Like they're in front of an audience of 50 people or 1,000 people?
Yes, that was the way it was because it was so new. And you realized I'm talking to everybody in this city simultaneously. Oh, my goodness. The days of Wolfman Jack and these guys. And then over time, we're like, okay, well, here's how it actually practically plays out. You're talking to typically one person, and he's in the car, and nobody's distracting him. It's you and them. And so I am talking to one person when I'm doing my monologue episodes almost entirely. I'm thinking about just one person. And sometimes I actually have one person in mind. And it makes it that kind of casual, close, intimate conversation because it's just me and you. And it's not me and everybody out there in radio land around the world. Right. So that's part of what makes that tone the tone. Okay. And the other part of it is that I'm genuinely lighthearted. And even with a difficult topic, I just have this confidence that, well, we'll get through it. And God understands that it's difficult. And he's got big boy pants. He's okay if I'm struggling. We're going to get through it. We'll be all right.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. So kind of following along with that, this is something that you've wanted to do. This is finally the outlet for a passion that you've had. I mean, the rest of us aren't studying radio style and to be able to compare, ye olden days of radio news versus the wisdom of the great talk radio hosts. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that this is something that you'd been wanting to do, but is there anything else that you'd want to say about that?
Well, when I was attending, at the time it was Oregon Bible College, it's Atlanta Bible College, I worked in the publishing department doing layout for pages that were going to get printed into books or whatever. And we always had the radio on. Gordon Landry was my boss at the time, and he just had WLS out of Chicago on from morning to the end of day. And I heard the liberal, the conservative, I heard all of it.
Mm.
And then I would listen to other radio, like Christian radio at night, and I would hear people talk in ways that were condescending. I would hear them hang up on people who asked really hard questions.
Mm.
I would hear the kind of bravado that comes from somebody who's just certain they are entirely right. Hank Hanegraaff's The Bible Answer Man was one of those. Call and get your answers. I could not stomach it. I was like, no, there is other ways to do this.
Mm.
First, you can enjoy the process. You can have fun. You can meet people and enjoy relating to people with a common understanding that, hey, wait, we're all looking at Scripture and trying to see what does it say. That should probably soften the club beating down to maybe just Nerf swords, perhaps. So those kinds of experiences drove me to think, I want to do this. And that's why I got into radio. I wanted to have a show. But as it turns out, Unitarian Christians wanting a syndicated talk show across the United States, there really wasn't a lot of opportunity for that.
There wasn't a huge market for that? People
No.
were knocking down your door? You're kidding.
No, I mean, so you go to the secular ones and it's like, are you looking for a Christian? What? Then you go to the Christian ones and say, hey, are you looking for a Unitarian to be? So no, it just didn't happen. And that's why I went on into computer science and became a software developer so I could actually feed my family. So it had just been this passion of mine for the longest time, and I'd just been busy, kids, work, and now my kids are a little older. It's a chance to revisit this passion, and I'm really enjoying it.
I want to say, for those of us that are on the receiving end of all that preparation, thanks a lot. And and personally, thanks to, for those of you that don't know, I record the audio for the UCA videos. And I'm Grasshopper and Marcus Sensei teaching me the ways of the microphone. So if you look back at our old videos, you can tell that I'm a novice at it. And hopefully as time has gone on with Mark's help, they've gotten a little better. So
Yeah.
thanks, Mark.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. Yeah, so I love audio content, but what drives me is audio content that is understandable. Part of that, of course, is just delivery and enunciation. But it's also the way you put information together. Now, my monologues are actually written out. I write the whole thing out. And I do that because I'm so committed to getting the point across in a clean and direct way. I value the listener's time intensely. Even after I write an entire monologue and I'm editing it, I'll pull sections out and just say, nope, that's too much. I really want it to be tight, clear, and understandable so that you don't even have to reach up and go back 15 seconds and listen to it again and back 15 seconds and listen to it again, because it's very annoying to do, especially if you're in a car driving. So I'm very cognizant of content, delivery, timing. I think about way too much. That's fine. But it works, and it makes the process interesting to me, and I'm able to take all of that stuff, put it into an episode, and listen to it back and say, there, that's what I wanted it to be. And knowing that these episodes are going to live on the internet forever, I don't mind that I spend an hour on 15 seconds of Hildy's interview. People will enjoy it by the thousands eventually, you know.
I know it's a ton of work, and we're all very grateful, Mark, for you being willing to do that. And I know each week and each episode is eagerly anticipated by me and others. So thank you. Please keep up the good work.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for letting me sit on this side of the discussion for once.
Well, it's a lot of fun. I think we'll do this a few more times. Maybe there'll be certain topics where it'd be better that I do the off the cuff, trying my best to answer the questions. You know, when I do a monologue, I don't think about some of this stuff.
Sure.
But then you ask the questions, and I'm like, okay, well, let me explain this.
Well, then let's make sure and make the offer to the audience. If you would like to ask a question of Mark, the best way to do that is...
Well, you could get the question to me just emailing podcast@unitarianchristianalliance.org. But if you would like it to be a question that comes out like this, you probably should mention it and be like, Brandon should ask you, blah, 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 blah. Because I'm liable to just respond to the email and say, well, here's the answer. And then I would write it. And then you'd be like, no. I wanted that to be an interview topic. So if you do have a question, write it in an email. and then mention that this would be fun for the interview. This would be good for a Brandon interview, Mark.
And then I'll do my best to hold his feet to the fire, folks.
Ouch.
Particularly if you can ask him something really uncomfortable, please send those along.
Oh.
And anyway, and then don't forget there's that button on the website where you can submit your own audio feedback and get your voice on the podcast and be heard.
Yeah,
because that's really what this is about. We're wanting to connect Unitarians together, and this is one of the best tools that I've seen to do that. It's excellent. I really appreciate it, Mark.
Thank you, Brandon. Last week, I was away at my group's annual meeting, and I got to do a workshop on podcasting. If you were there, wasn't that fun? And thank you for coming. I had 75 minutes, and I filled it solid. It's easy to talk at length about things you are passionate about. There is a chance, maybe a small chance, that you have considered doing a podcast. It's not really surprising. The situation you and I find ourselves in is unique. We have pertinent information that is often neglected, or worse, forcefully rejected. Frequently, that rejection comes without an open and respectful discussion, and it can be quite frustrating. Granted, not every Trinitarian will do this. You may be one of those Trinitarians. You're actually listening right now, which naturally makes you more inclined to listening and engaging. Kudos to you, my friend. Anyhow, it's natural that a portion of folks like us would want to do something about it, to speak out, and perhaps podcast. It's not all of us, of course. There's also a chance that you have deep social ties, maybe family, who would likely upturn your life if they knew you were not Trinitarian. Maybe you have nieces or nephews you love and regularly visit, and maybe the family would put an end to that if they knew you weren't on board with those most esteemed creeds. If that's you, then a podcast is probably the last thing you would do. I get it. If you have thought you might want to do a podcast, there are a wide variety of podcast types. You notice what I do is different than, say, the Trinities podcast or Restitutio. There really aren't rules to podcasting. An episode has no correct length or style. There's no requirement for episode frequency, like weekly, monthly, or whatever. There's just you and your particular vision for what your podcast could be. What I do in this podcast is distinctly me. I have a style that may seem odd, and maybe at first you thought I was stuck up and snobby. Rest assured, it's just my humor. I'm really a very nice heretic. Since we are partaking today in the spirit of the reversal and the switcheroo, I want to point out another Unitarian Christian podcast that is distinctly different than mine. What I appreciate about these guys is that they know what they are and what they aren't. They don't spend time with recording room setups, long sessions of editing audio, and expensive gear. In terms of production level, their podcast is the inverse of mine, the opposite extreme. But they know it. That's the key. They know that they won't compete with hugely popular podcasts which have producers, editors, etc., and they're okay with it. The best part is that they have stuck with it. Now, with over 50 episodes, it's called Breakfast Theology. Here, listen.
Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Breakfast Theology. I'm Josiah Cain.
I'm Chuck Jones.
We are here again to bring to you a high-quality podcast filled with much of background noise and other talking, clanking of plates, and a little bit of maybe good theology.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josiah and Chuck, for plowing ahead with your own unique spin on a podcast. Oh, and can you pass the salt? We are a unique lot. So many backgrounds and experiences, but one thing is connecting us. We are Unitarian Christians.
Knock, knock.
What? Oh, who's there?
God is a...
God is a who?
Correct. God is a who, not a what.
Wait, what?
No, a who.
Noah's the guy who built the ark.
Never mind.
History in the making. The first Unitarian Christian knock-knock joke to grace the podcasting airwaves. Oh, note to self. Add this to the Unitarian Christian Museum. Thanks, Brandon Russell. Well done. If you have a knock-knock joke, an entry for the Unitarian Christian Museum, episode 29, or anything to add as audio, there's a link to record yourself in the show notes. And there's a nice orange button on the site, podcast.unitarianchristianalliance.org. I'm happy to receive emails, too. And again, if you have questions that would be good for a future reverse interview, mention that in your note. Not sure how long it'll be before the next one, but we are all very patient here. Email podcast@unitarianchristianalliance.org. If you signed up for the UCA podcast email, and you can do that from the same website I just mentioned, you get reminders when new shows appear, right in your inbox. And you get extra thoughts from me about the show. In this week's email, I mentioned two of my former guests who met each other for the first time this last week, and I got to see it. I snapped a photo. It was like a reunion, even though they hadn't met before. That, my friend, is the magic. And now you too can experience the same magic at the first annual UCA conference. I am honored to be the MC. But I think it's just because that's my initials. October 15th through 17th, learn more at the UCA website, unitarianchristianalliance.org. And we did it. Made it through another episode. Brandon, I really enjoyed this. Let's do it again sometime. Thank you. May God bless you in your truth pursuits. I hope this podcast serves you well.